Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Alumni Festival 2020 at Cambridge University. This is the prime Wednesday evening live event. Thank you all for joining us. We're here to talk about history. My name is Peter Frankopan. I'm Professor of Global History at Oxford, but I promise you, once upon a time, a Cambridge man. I was an undergraduate, studied history there, really a very long time ago indeed. And I'm in conversation tonight with a real superstar of not just Cambridge history, but of modern history writing here in the UK, Sujit Sivasundaram, who is Professor of World History and a Fellow at Caius College, and is also Director of the Centre for South Asian Studies at Cambridge. We're here to talk about Sujit's remarkable new book, Waves Across the South. I'll say a few words about Sujit, but then Sujit will talk for a little bit about his book. We'll then have a conversation together and then Q&A with the audience, all of you who've been very kind enough to join us. Thank you all in advance for joining us. These events and this festival is such an important part for Cambridge to showcase what it is that the university does. And I'd just like to shout out quickly to the humanities, because sometimes in universities, we rightly celebrate the joys of the sciences, but our great universities, not least Cambridge, do pioneering work across the humanities too, and particularly in history. So Sujit is a fantastic person to talk about that with us this evening. I first came across his work with this book here called Islanded, which came out 6 or 7 years ago, reassessing Britain's relationship with Sri Lanka and the Indian Ocean. This new book, Waves Across the South, A New History of Revolution, challenges us to rethink not just about other parts of the world, but using the history of revolution, of empire, of Oceania, of the Pacific, of the Indian Ocean, to look back at change within Europe itself. So it's an enormous pleasure to welcome Sujit. The downside of doing this virtually is there can't be rapturous applause either at the beginning or at the end. But Sujit, welcome, lovely to see you.
Thank you, Peter, so much for that really generous introduction. And also thank you so much to the University Development Office for inviting Peter and I to have this conversation together. So as Peter very kindly sort of did the advertising already, but let me also hold the book, because of course there is a physical book in the middle of this conversation and in the middle of the pandemic, Waves Across the South, A New History of Revolution and Empire, which came out just a few weeks ago. And in the old world, if I can call it like that, the pre-COVID-19 world, that is, I was looking forward to presenting it to various public audiences. And so I'm really glad to have this chance to outline its arguments here and to have a conversation about it this evening. So the slides have started, and the slides will involve some images. I will include some images from the book in the initial 20 minutes before we open it up to a conversation between Peter and I, and also the questions that you want to raise across Zoom. So this is the cover of the book, and I'm quite pleased with how it turned out. The motif on the front and the back, and along the spine as well, takes its inspiration really from the maps or navigational tools that Pacific Islanders have used over a very long period to find, or used over a very long period to find their way across this huge expanse of water, which is their home ocean, the Pacific Ocean. So indigenous peoples undertook these voyages across the Pacific Islands, traveling from west to east, beginning from around 6,000 years ago or so. They traveled in outrigger canoes or double-hulled canoes. They took water, fermented breadfruit at times, plants and animals at times, styles of pottery spread with them, and there was a great deal of contact across the Pacific Ocean. Their maps were made out of coconut fronds or sticks and shells, and so shells appear on the cover of the book as well. And these denote the currents and the placement of islands. They relied on star positions at night, the sun during the day, and there were various other kinds of natural signs, birds, the speed of the wind, the swell of the sea, and so on, was very significant to these historic navigations across the vast Pacific Ocean. So given that context, which is an oceanic context, and that context is central to the book, it seemed very appropriate then to have it at the front of the book, around the cover as well. So the book itself is not only about the Pacific Ocean, it's also about the Indian Ocean, the two large stretches of ocean outside the Atlantic. Unlike the Atlantic, these two oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, arguably were not defined by Europeans. The Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean had, especially the Indian Ocean, had a complicated system of trade which bound it together. There was religious exchange, and certainly cultural exchange as well was a characteristic feature across these two oceans, much prior to European intrusion. So this book is about European intrusion in the context of this very long-standing pattern of exchange and understanding. Specifically, it's about a critical period that gave rise to modern colonization. And this is the period of the late 18th and the early 19th centuries, the so-called Age of Revolutions. So we move on to the next slide. So here is a surfboat landing in Madras, bringing European passengers from the ship, which you can see behind. The surfboat is taking two Europeans across the surf and onto the beach. So this gives you a feel really for this period of the late 18th and the early 19th centuries in these oceans. Many people were moving globally across the ocean, but moving across the ocean was a really dangerous activity, something that we forget in our new age of global travel. Things could go wrong. Ships could be wrecked. The monsoon could hit. People could get washed off the ship into the sea, or they could fall ill oftentimes as well. So there was no technological supremacy over nature in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So this is the Age of Revolution story, which I want to take in this book, which I have taken, I hope, to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And the Age of Revolution story is normally an Atlantic one. It's a story that undergraduates in Cambridge know quite well. So first there was the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. Then there was the French Revolution. Then there was the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century. All of that sort of moved across the Atlantic. There were revolutions, for instance, in Haiti, in the Caribbean. Then there were revolutions, independence movements in Latin America, which gave rise to independent states. So this is an Atlantic story, a narrative that we historians know quite well. The story is important because it's about a lot of things that we take for granted in our world today. It's about the emergence of the idea of the nation, arguably, or consolidation of the idea of the nation and the system of nation states. It's about rights and liberties, about citizenship. It's even about the forging of new forms of reason, of science and technology. It's about the reform of labor and certainly enslavement, which changed in this period. And it's about the emergence of public debate as well. So if that is the story that we know about from the Atlantic world, and the significance of the story is quite clear from some of the points that I've just made, the story is barely taken to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. It's rarely been taken across to these other two seas. And the revolutionary culture in the East is often seen to be derivative from the Atlantic. So democracy travels to the East from the West. So it's that sort of argument that this book tries to turn on its head by beginning in often forgotten Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean sites. And I kind of put this image up because the idea of the wave is quite significant for the book, as is evident also from the title. And here's a sort of breaking wave. Water matters to this story. And so the argument could be summarized by the model of the wave, by this picture in part as well. There were a series of waves across the Indian and Pacific Ocean. There was a revolutionary wave, which was indigenous and multiply so from different cultural perspectives across these two oceans. And it was set against a colonial wave, a British imperial wave, which sought to suppress the indigenous revolutionary wave that ran ahead of it, and which took up the language of liberty, the British Empire, adopted it. It presented itself as spreading rights and liberty, and so it overtook that other wave, which was the indigenous wave. So having now summarized the argument, let me move more quickly through some other images from the book as a way of just giving you a sense of what's in it, what the contents are, and who some of the figures are as well. So here is a late 19th century photograph of the monarch of Tonga. And in the book, at the start of the book, I spent quite a bit of time in the South Pacific, where I track how new monarchies were consolidated in the age of revolutions. And so this comes as an indigenous wave in the terms of the argument I just set out. So I also track this in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I include the account of Hongi Hika, who arrived in London in 1820. He went back to New Zealand with gifts, with patronage, with hundreds of muskets. And this allowed him, Hongi Hika, to mount a campaign to consolidate his power. He was a fighter, an iconic fighter in New Zealand. And so what you see there is the consolidation or the evolution of notions of chieftaincy, and finally the emergence of the Kingi-Tonga movement, the search for a Maori monarch in New Zealand. In Tonga, to pick up this picture, which is on your screen, we see the evolution of chieftaincy into real monarchy, in the sense of monarchy as a real practice. And in the book, I use the idea of raiding to explain this. So there were European ships going through the Pacific. They were, discussing political ideas. They were looking for kings and queens. Of course, this was the age of revolutions. They had lots of weapons with them, lots of so-called pirates on board as well. And so what happens is that that's a European system of raiding and a French system of raiding and a British system of raiding, arguably in the Pacific. But you also have Pacific Islanders then raiding these ships, stripping them off, stripping the guns off, taking people captive, taking them as advisors in local wars. And as that exchange of ideas proceeds, we see the consolidation of new monarchic lines across the Pacific, with, for instance, the baptism of George I of Tonga. The name is significant in terms of modeling. George I of Tonga was baptized in 1831. Moving forward, South Africa is, the next slide, is a significant site for the early parts of the book as well, the Cape Colony. And here I chart a series of revolts and uprisings in the Cape Colony. It's a sort of way station, and so there are a whole range of people kind of going through the Cape in this period. And so we see also a whole series of different revolutionary cultures, including trek Boers, European descendants, standing up for their rights against the Dutch East India Company. We see enslaved peoples inverting the cruel hierarchies and adopting some of the cultural baggage of their superiors in revolt. And we see Khoisan peoples or indigenous peoples as well, raiding settler farms. So at least three, but in fact many other forms of revolt in Southern Africa at this moment of the age of revolutions. Critically, I say it's oceanic. There are supplies coming in from Batavia. There's an awareness of the wider world. Islam can at times play a role, really interestingly, at the Cape in this period, as a British worry that, say, enslaved peoples are not converting to Christianity. Moving on to the next slide. Next door is Mauritius, which again is a really important site for the age of revolutions. And here, once again, I'm interested in the oceanic dimensions, the connections across those waves, across the south. And so I actually have not a Mauritian necessarily, but Tipu Sultan of Mysore, who was, of course, characterized, was well known in the period under the title of an Oriental despot, quote unquote, in British propaganda. So he's in South India, but he is in contact, as I reveal in the book, with Mauritius. And there's an exchange of revolutionary culture between French India, more broadly, and the Southwest Indian Ocean, which links up to Dutch South Africa as well in turn. And so what you get across these two worlds, the Dutch world of Southern Africa and the French Indian Ocean world, is the arrival of the British with a sense of anxiety about the spread of republicanism, and also about the impact of the French. Moving forward, we proceed in the book to other parts of the Indian Ocean, and here we have an image from Ras Al Khaimah in the Gulf. There's a whole chapter in the book on the Persian Gulf in the age of revolutions. And here I was really interested in, because I didn't know about these before, to discover more detail about these invasive expeditions that the British launched to the Gulf, the early history of British invasion in the Gulf, arguably, in 1809 and 1819-20. So firstly, in the Napoleonic period, and secondly, in a post-Napoleonic period. So as you can see in the image, there's a lot of looting and burning going on, and that's because it's, once again, it's a sort of maritime idea operating here. The idea is that there were pirates in the Gulf, and these pirates were stopping British maritime commerce, and so this needed to be stopped. And of course, the notion of piracy, this is not a phase where there is a sort of consensus about the law. People are operating with different ideas of the law. So the idea of the pirate itself is constructed in context. So it's a subjective definition of maritime activity. And so what you get is the British coming in and invading the Gulf like this. Now, behind this story of 1809, 1819, 1820 is the Wahhabi movement, a reformist movement of Islamic purity. And I argue that that is consistent with the age of revolutions. So the British then tried to make treaties with local rulers, and they tried to kind of roll out a definition of the modern state in this context of the Gulf. But it's really important because of the way Islam functions more broadly in the book, and also of the way we need to kind of think about Islam today in global history, to say that the Wahhabi movement isn't the only thing happening here, which can be characterized as Islamic. The book also tracks Oman in the age of revolutions with a very different style of Islamic practice at this precise moment of time. Additionally, it looks at the Gulf from the Ottoman Empire and also from Persia on the other side, and suggests that the Persian Gulf, as it sees these revolutionary forces and counter-revolutionary imperialism contending for power, had also to come to terms with the historic legacy of the Ottoman Empire and the Persian realm next door. Moving to the next slide, I was really keen in the book to make room for Aboriginal Australian people because they're often lost in global histories. Here is one figure. He's Bungaree. He's dressed in second-hand clothing given by departing colonial officials. Military and naval gear was given second-hand to indigenous peoples. And there's a breastplate around his neck, which calls him a chief. In the press of the period, as I sort of discuss in the book, on a few occasions, indigenous peoples could be called republicans. They could be called chiefs. They could be called kings. And so that, once again, is the age of revolutions vocabulary. Quite literally, this man is being racialized and dressed up in the age of revolutions. The artist who draws him up also drew up freedom fighters in Latin America in this period. Moving further on in the images, what I wanted to do was to actually track something else beneath all the rhetoric which surrounded, colonial rhetoric which surrounded Aboriginal peoples, and which makes it very, very hard to get to their own perspective in this story. And so where I found that was on the coast of Tasmania. And here there's a section in the book which is about the seal trade, where indigenous women in particular play a really important role in sealing alongside a very polyglot community of escaped convicts and other European and American nationals operating here illegally, arguably, but again, what is the law in this period, in this place? So basically, indigenous women come in, and their presence, I argue, is part of the age of revolutions. But of course, we also get the horrific violence which unfolds in Tasmania, and which some historians have called a genocide, then coming into this story as well. Next slide, please. So as Peter said, the last book I wrote was on Sri Lanka, and I think I found it quite amusing that this book, Waves, has already been classified as a history of Sri Lanka, but actually, Sri Lanka only features briefly and in passing in this book. However, yes, it does feature. But what I try to do with the book is to think about the Bay of Bengal as a broader region in the last quarter, really, of the book. And with Sri Lanka and the Kingdom of Kandy in the middle of Sri Lanka, I think about warfare, British warfare against indigenous kingdoms. So the Kingdom of Kandy, as I say, I put next to the Kingdom of Ava, shown, and this is why the images are in Burma, Myanmar, and also the British invasion of Java in fear of republicanism in 1811. And so I sketch a sort of arc, if you like, of warfare, which is maritime, across the Bay of Bengal. And I sketch that in relation to indigenous connections, which are about the circulation of monks, Buddhist monks, between Burma, Myanmar, the Kingdom of Ava and the Kingdom of Kandy, fighters from Java and their role in Kandy, Orientalists trying to track the sort of relationship between these various political units across the Bay of Bengal. So that just gives you a sense of the themes of the counter-revolution. This is about war. Earlier I was talking about race a little bit in passing with Bungaree, the Aboriginal Australian. I also wanted to think quite a lot about knowledge at the end of the book. And so we move on to the next slide, which once again is from the Bay of Bengal. I don't know if you can see it, but basically it's Chinese laborers dividing up stones on Pulau Ubin, which you can visit on a bumboat, as they call it, as I did this from Singapore. If you're fed up of Singapore, get on a bumboat and go to Pulau Ubin. And so here they are, breaking stones. What are they doing? They're building a lighthouse. So in this sort of section of the Bay of Bengal, I say the counter-revolution is certainly about war, as I've just sketched. It's about race and gender, but it's also about a huge amount of data gathering. The British are mapping the weather, mapping the seas, mapping a whole series of different things, astronomy, and then also building lighthouses in order to then trade, for instance, between India and China. And as the book finishes, it finishes with cities. And so the last slide is one of the cities that features the capital of Mauritius. So I argued that really in this tussle between the Age of Revolutions and the British Empire, adopting the science, adopting the language of kingship, adopting the tools of war as well. In that tussle between these two forms, the revolutionary waves, which I sort of outlined earlier, we see the emergence then of a lot of things that we take to be modern, and the modern city is emblematic of this. In the sense that these modern cities arise, and well, not arise, but expand demographically in this period hugely. And the kinds of questions that you've got to work out in a city like Port Louis are what happens with formerly enslaved people? How do you deal with environmental events? What is race? How much rights do different people have? And these kinds of questions energize the early public sphere in these places. And so really we end up with a lot of things we take to be normal. So as I look back at it, and just a few closing sort of comments in retrospect on Waves Across the South, I think Peter kind of blurbs it as bringing forgotten places. Is that right, Peter? Yes, new perspectives on how we can look at regions, places, and peoples that have been left to one side of traditional histories. And I think that's right, actually, because what I've tried to do is to bring places like Tonga or Oman or Mauritius or Burma, places that don't figure very heavily in the history syllabus in the UK for sure, and don't figure very much outside these very territories. Their histories are not known outside the territory. So Sri Lankan history will be known in Sri Lanka, and it might be known in some other places, but not really very much. So to bring these places which have been marginalized, which are oceanic, to mount a broader argument about the global history of this period. And arguably they're especially revealing sites because they're oceanic and the ocean mattered in this period, but also because the Age of Revolutions was about working out what counts as a political unit, what counts as good rule, what counts as freedom, And some of the best places to do that, to kind of have that debate, were small places, which were island ones. So yes, so let me close there and hand back to Peter.
Good. You can hear and see me. Fantastic. That was great, Sujit. And what I love about the book is you do lots of things, but you do three really big things. One is that you explain change, and I was very careful. I didn't say forgotten. These places are not forgotten by people who live there. It's just traditional. So but in the traditional way that we look at the world from Europe with all of our wonderful scholars, they just don't get any attention. So it's about restoring that, and you do that by looking from these regions and places and peoples and cultures back toward their engagement with each other as well as back towards Europe. You also tell sort of, I think there's a thread that goes through about how this also changed the world, how it changed in particular, how it changed Britain, engagements with other parts of the world. And then the third thing you do is you tell a story of globalization, again, not through the perspective of North Atlantic trade or even with sub-Saharan Africa, but with regions that really are profoundly important individually. And when you start to see Tipu Sultan sending embassies to Mauritius and being fully aware of revolutionary France and ideas that are going on and working out what would appeal to French sensitivities, I think we start to draw a picture of a world that is where information supply is being transmitted in this crucial period you're talking about from the late 18th century onwards. So I wonder which of those three, I mean, maybe you enjoyed them all equally. I mean, as a historian, what have you enjoyed most about writing this book? Is it about throwing new shade and recentering perspectives? Is it about coloring in better that European picture that we now have a whole new set of materials to look at? Or is it about this big picture? How do you see, what have you enjoyed most about it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think I have a single answer in the sense that I've enjoyed lots of different things about writing it. I mean, just at a basic level, I've enjoyed researching it. I've enjoyed spending time in Mauritius talking to scholars and historians and people, members of the public, really, about their understanding of history. And similarly in Tonga or Singapore and Burma, Myanmar as well. And I think that's really, really important for me to highlight because it is a book that has arisen out of a whole number of conversations in situ. And you're absolutely right that it's not forgotten. I shouldn't have used the word forgotten because the book is a whole series of histories which are very well known in the places that those histories are about, but they're not well known in Britain. And that's the contradiction really that I have to surmount. So yes, I enjoyed having these conversations with various people and also doing research in archives and collections and trying to figure out how the history still resonates in particular sites in Mauritius and Tasmania and so forth. So that's one thing to say. The second thing to say is that I guess it's an ambitious book. There's no doubting that. And the reason why I kind of went for the Age of Revolutions argument is to actually sort of bring these sites to the forefront of historical writing. And that has been challenging at times, for sure, but really enjoyable as well, because I realized that for whatever reason, historians see certain stories, the Age of Revolution story, or even the British Empire story, really, to reside, to sort of be located in particular places. So the British Empire story might be linked to the late 19th century in Africa or the late 18th century in India or whatever. So I think actually taking a story which is well known to somewhere where it's not been has been at times challenging, but actually really, really enjoyable as well. So those are the two things that I would highlight. I mean, certainly I didn't expect for it to come out at a certain kind of moment with BLM and so forth. And so it's been interesting to see, and I wait to see what the reception of it will be.
So tell us a bit about that. I mean, it's not at all what you BLM. It's the timing is just what it is, but I mean it's those questions about equality of positions in history, of roles, of exploitation, of race, of identity. I mean, it's very conspicuous in the BLM narrative. There's been no discussion about what that means from an Oceanic, for example, Aboriginal perspective, but there are obviously very similar, if not identical, questions. I mean, how do you relate the contemporary to the work you're writing about? I mean, are they the same question? Are there sensitivities that is fundamentally different? Transatlantic slave trade from West Africa, particularly across the Atlantic, is that a different story to British imperial engagement in India, in the Bay of Bengal, in Burma, Oceania? How do you understand those?
Well, that's excellent. I mean, of course, there have been protests in Australia as well, which have been directly related to the status of Aboriginal people. So I guess the BLM, Black Lives Matter movement, has in turn opened up a debate about Indigenous peoples elsewhere in the global south. So it's not disconnected. However, I totally agree with you that they're not the same story, in the sense that I don't think that the status of Black heritage people and their role and their absence in history, and the reason why we need to reckon with the legacies of enslavement, is exactly the same as thinking about the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. I mean, it would be crazy to totally equate all of that, because the history is different. It happens at a different moment. The way it connects up with institution making, or with the making of fortunes even, is different. So I think we need to be very much aware of that and sensitive to that, and that we shouldn't fold everything into one. Ideally, what I'd really like is to have a diversity of histories across the global south. And so I don't present this as the only history of the age of revolutions. Of course, all the Atlanticists would kill me if I did. But I think this is an important history that needs its own place. And within it, there are different histories. Certainly the history of Aboriginal Australians is different to the history of the Parsis who were building ships for Oman. It's different to the Burmese monks in contact with Sri Lanka. It's different to Tipu Sultan in Mauritius too. Whilst understanding that difference and making it possible to sort of reflect on that difference, there's also something to be said for putting things together. And that's the end point. Because you can see parallels and similarities and forms of solidarity even that move across these various sites. And so putting together the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean was an experiment in that as well. So to return to your question about the Atlantic and enslavement and its legacies and BLM, I think there are resonances today in the protests. There are connections in the period, say with Haiti playing a role in New Zealand or in Mauritius, but we also need to not just flatten everything into the same thing, really.
I mean, I'm sure no one, apart from I hope you've got some of your students listening in before the beginning of term. No one wants to spend too long thinking about methodologies, but this is a difficult thing to write about from top down, but also bottom up. Oftentimes there are, I've spent too much time watching Netflix. Often there are either oral traditions, or the primary source material is very complex to deal with, and so on. How do you navigate the challenges of picking out which voices to select? Because usually those are sort of pre-selected by Europeans who are interested. Like your images that you've shown. They're usually, or very 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 often, through European eyes, of things that stand out or look like they're important or interesting, or dressing people up in colonial outfits to sort of blend the two. How do you approach the complexity of giving local voices, but always through this arrival of new people and new players into the regions?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. That's certain, because a lot of the sources, a lot of the images are colonial. And I highlight that at the start of the book and explain why these colonial images are in the book and how I hope to use them. I mean, just to take the example of Bungaree, to make this very specific, because you mentioned that image. So with that material, what I tried to do was to actually make space for Cora, who was Bungaree's wife, one of his wives, and to argue that her story needs a place alongside Bungaree. Bungaree is actually really well known in Australia, and he's the most portrayed. He's said to be the first person to be called an Australian in print. I think there are more than 10 images of him from the period. And so he's relatively well known, but I wanted to then bring in Cora, and also to bring in the indigenous, Aboriginal Australian women off the coast of Tasmania as well. So I guess from where I sit, it's partly about, yes, one starts with the colonial, one starts with well-known figures or iconic figures, Hongi Hika similarly, or Parsi shipbuilders, but then one sort of goes beyond them into another history.
I mean, it's a wonderful range of characters you introduce. I mean, tell us about Hongi Hika, because he has a connection with Cambridge. Tell us about his visit.
Yeah, so the visit to Cambridge doesn't feature in the book, but there are some people researching it in Cambridge at the moment. He spends time at Queen's College with a linguist. But of course, Hongi Hika goes back to New Zealand and is a fighter, and he takes weapons, muskets with him, and he launches this wide-scale war. So he is someone, once again, who is finding his own political fortunes in the midst of. But
uses it. I mean, but he uses his experiences of what he sees in England or in Britain and the technologies that he acquires on the way back that fundamentally change the relationship of power in back home in New Zealand.
That's right, and that's a broader argument. Even with the Tongan story, it's literally things being taken off the ships. So there are prior traditions of chieftaincy which are evolving, and there are wars afoot between different kind of groups. However, what the argument that I'm mounting is that when these Europeans come in increasing number through the late 18th and the early 19th century, and ships are wrecked, for instance, on islands like in Tonga, then ships can be burnt, they could be stripped, people could be taken, and it's in that process that new things happen. So monarchy is consolidated in Tonga or across other Pacific sites in this period as well. So it's that creative appropriation, really, of the European stuff, the weapons, the ideas, everything that counts as stuff, really, including the Europeans themselves, who sometimes take up Pacific ways and are portrayed as having gone native. The missionaries also coming into the story, the European missionaries and their ideas being taken up for indigenous purposes.
What about the sort of, in terms, I mean, I know you look at it backwards, inwards, but I mean, it clearly has such a profound effect on Britain's empire building. How would you characterize that Britain acquired these places sort of by mistake, one after another, changed them inadvertently, sometimes deliberately, and that it was the making of this superpower? I mean, because no one would imagine that at the beginning of the story, that somehow these are the sinews, whether they wanted to be or not, and usually not, of this enormous global maritime superpower.
So the absence of mind thesis, which is the British suddenly found themselves with an empire, of course I don't buy that, because intentionality is really, really important to the argument that I'm mounting. So there are these indigenous peoples wanting to find their own way. Some of them are elite, some of them are non-elite, some of them are men, some of them are women. And then the British come along and they are trying to suppress and control these territories. So in terms of where the decision-making is happening, it's happening at the ground level in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, in the interactions of colonizing forces and indigenous peoples. And it's an uneven power dynamic. And it involves invasion of the kind one sees in the Gulf, for instance. So it's a slow process. It's step by step. However, it's uneven, like those waves, which is why I use the idea of waves. But by the time we get into the 1840s, Britain is supreme. And so the result is pretty clear, even if the steps are actually quite piecemeal. And by the 1840s, where the book ends, which I didn't say actually, a lot of these territories, there's a lot of printing that goes on and so on. And already we're getting the first histories of the British Empire by 1850. And there the story sort of becomes something else. A lot of the uncertainty of this earlier period is forgotten. That's partly why it's taken, there's a lot of print from the late 19th century that one needs to peel back to get to this late 18th, early 19th century history.
Well, what do you think the platform that you've laid? I mean, what happens next? Do you think that, either you or the next stage is to take this on from the 1840s onwards? Is it that you think that the same book, what the parallel book should be looking at other parts of the world and applying the same kinds of questions and methodologies to different parts of the Indian Ocean?
That's a very good question. And I don't know which book I'm going to write next, Peter. It's the middle of a pandemic, so I'm not quite sure, if I'm totally honest with you. But yes, arguably it could be taken further. It could be taken from 1848 up to 1914. into the age of steam. Steamships are arriving in the middle of this book, and there's material, for instance, on people in Singapore observing the arrival, indigenous elites observing the arrival of steamships, and then steamships getting stuck on the sand in Burma, Myanmar as well. So the age of steam is coming, but it's not achieving as much as it will do by the late 19th century. So then what happens with the takeoff of plantation systems, in more plantation really, in Sri Lanka or in Fiji, and so on, much more migration. So that story certainly could be told. And it's also a story that we don't really know,
Yeah.
to be totally honest with you, because once again, for that period, we can talk about the partition of Africa. We talk about continents. It'd be interesting to ask you about this actually, Peter, because of course your work is cross-continental. So what do you think about the oceanic dimension of this? So in that late 19th century kind of moment, once again, we don't know that story around, I mean, the Great Game is certainly, you know, in the continents, but then what happens in these island territories, and what is the environmental change, by the way, as well?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And there's some obvious similarities between, for example, nomadism in Central Asia, oral traditions, shifting tribal structures, competition that, you know, that in exactly the same way, no Central Asian would ever want to be defined by what the Russians or the British or the Chinese are doing. They'd be want to be defined on their own terms, exactly as you're doing in your book. And
Yeah.
yet they're part of this much bigger global international relations power position. And equally in the 19th, 20th century and today, of course, responses to climate and the pressures and the opportunities that gives is probably a starting point rather than a kind of paragraph that needs to get put in. So I think that there are some parallels with these sort of what look like they're liminal, look like they're peripheral, look like they're somehow sort of add-ons because societies are smaller, they're not living in cities, they don't write things down. And so that provides the cultural intellectual hegemony for Western European history writers to write in a way that looks familiar, because we write books that tend to look at things in similar kinds of ways. So it is extremely ambitious.
Yes,
doing.
and of course, yeah, and your work is sort of over a very long period, which is really admirable, whereas this is a book about a few decades. So I just wonder, in a sense, would you see this, the long-term oceanic history across these zones, from what you know, as in some ways parallel to the kind of story that you write in Silk Roads?
Well,
I mean,
yeah, I mean, I think it's
oceanic Silk Roads as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in that world, the archaeological evidence, particularly the climate science, but also their habitations, and the difficulties are, of course, in island communities, there are high levels of erosion, typically high levels of precipitation, and so it's just harder to get a handle on what you're looking at, and it's quite hard to write history. And what you do so beautifully in this book is that you introduce us to people, and you can tell their stories about who they are, and that humanizes. You can insert them. They can tell stories about gender or about husbands and wives or multiple or polygamy. They can tell you about travel and kingship, and it's quite hard to do that on a blank canvas where you know, often the oral tradition is very, very limited, even if you're able to capture it at all. So I think you know, you do it so well, Sujit, and don't get me wrong, we've got colleagues who write books about a single day in the First World War.
Yeah, that's not going to be me, ever, I don't think.
When you say it's only a few decades, you know, that doesn't make it ambitious. I mean, the last question I want to ask you before, I know there are quite a lot of questions here, is, you know, there are sensitivities in history faculties about what world, I mean, you're Professor World History, I'm Global History, you know, about what these phrases mean. And, you know, if you're friends or anything like mine, they'll assume that because you're Professor World History, you know everything about all times, all places.
And of course I do. No, I don't.
yeah, phone a friend on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. But just while I put my glass on and pick out a few questions, what does being Professor of World History, I mean, step back from your books and your work, what does that mean? What does world history mean to a history graduate from Cambridge or those who didn't study who are listening in this evening? What is world history?
Yeah, so world history is a really growing part of the history faculty. There are very many colleagues now actually working in the world history subject group, which is a collection of people in the faculty who teach papers in the Middle East, on Africa, on Latin America, and so on and so on. And we're adding more people every year. We've just appointed a wonderful scholar who works on the connections between China and the Middle East over many centuries of the early modern world. The papers that we teach are really popular. Hopefully there are some students actually listening in to this. And the reason why they're popular is because, well, I mean, it's totally different to what people learn at school. Unfortunately, the school syllabus in the UK isn't very wide. And so people are just waiting when they come to university to discover these alternative histories. And so they're really popular. People write dissertations and they go on to graduate study. And many PhDs are conducted in this field as well. So there's a lot of enthusiasm behind it. What lies beneath that enthusiasm, I think partly is kind of related to what you're asking. Well, I guess it's a commitment to, I mean, history is about the breadth of humanity, right? And we need to know all these perspectives. We're not human if we don't, really. So we can't be narrow-minded in our histories and just think about it just in terms of national kind of positionality or something like this. That's not the history that we do. Really.
Okay. Well, look, I've got lots of questions. Some of them are quite long, so I'll have to. For those of us anonymous, for those of us whose undergraduate curriculum involved expansion of Europe, how do you see your work relating to Gallagher, Robinson, or in Africa? How do you see your work relating to previous ideas that we're expansion? Is this a form of expansion of Europe too? Because Europe plays a role in this colonial story as well.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, people who've studied in the faculty will know about Gallagher, Robinson Gallagher, and so this idea of crises on the periphery. It overlaps as an argument, but they were not looking at the maritime context at all. And I think what this is doing is that it's bringing in much more cultural history than ever featured in those books. And certainly, race and gender and science and knowledge and so on and so forth. And even war here is partly cultural, about looting artifacts, say in Burma. So I think it's a very different kind of account of causation and change, but it overlaps in prioritizing local dynamics in the evolution of empire. So that's the way I suppose it relates to that long-standing debate.
I've got a question here, which is, to how far is this book? This is a nightmare question in finals.
Oh, okay.
How far is this book a history of encounter and exchange?
It is, and it isn't. In the sense that
solid answer.
Because I mean, to go back to those ships and the idea of raiding, that is exchange, and that is encounter. But there's a great deal of violence involved, and there's a great deal of power imbalance as well. And so that's one of the problems with just simply using encounter and exchange. Very short answer.
Could you say a little bit more about the oceanic basis of revolution in this period? To what extent do the pre-colonial maritime links in the Indian and Pacific Oceans aid or even determine the actions and responses of people in the lands and islands you describe?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, actually. And certainly they do, because certainly there are connections to South Africa much before this. There are trading links before this. But what I'm arguing for is prior things becoming more rigid and accelerated in this era, and that the acceleration and concretization, that is related to these global kind of connections, news coming, people coming, weapons coming, more ships coming, and so on. So it's what existed certainly plays a role, but it's also new.
Okay. Did Pacific and Indian Ocean peoples reflect back, quote, revolutionary waves to the Atlantic? And to what extent does the old Atlantic-centric historiography still have something to offer?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm not wanting to sort of erase that history in any way. I'm just making space for other accounts of the age of revolution. So certainly Haiti, as I said earlier, figures in 1808, I think, in the slave rebellion, the rebellion of enslaved peoples in the Cape, and that's in the book. And certainly it figures as a point of reference in New Zealand as well in the book. I tried not to pay too much attention to those resonances because those are, those would take me back to the Atlantic and take me away from, say, Tipu Sultan in Mauritius or Islam in the Cape. So I was more interested in the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean histories, connections in this book. But there's no denying that the Atlantic reverberates. Oh, the man who drew that painting, as I said earlier, was also interested in Latin America. The man who drew up Hungary.
This is a good one. Could you discuss some of the range of primary sources that you used? have you come across any new or unused sources, or is it more a question of piecing together existing underappreciated ones and challenging the existing narrative?
Yeah, so that's a methodology question. I think, so that's complicated because I wanted it to be securely based on new research. So it has involved archival work in various different places. At the same time, it does draw in the work of others for sure. And it's, as all good history, it's collaborative and relies on all of these conversations and insights from other people who are cited. So I wanted it to have that reach whilst being located in particular places. In terms of sources, as you would have already noticed, there's visual material, and I use visual material, there's material culture. There are a whole series of different kind of colonial writings, not from a single perspective, colonial officers, private traders, etc., missionaries, and so on and so forth. And as much as is possible, I tried to make space for indigenous voices. For the reason that Peter kind of mentions, that I wanted to sort of repeople world history from these sources.
Well, I can tell you, Sujit, we've got a lot of very good historians, lots of questions about sources.
Right, okay.
Which is lovely, exactly as there should be. So well done, history graduates, if that's you, and even better if you're not history graduates. Here's a good question. What's your opinion of how we could or should teach this period of history to students in secondary school? I mean, you said something about schools. I mean, do you have what are your views about that? I mean, what are your views when students come to apply to Cambridge and they haven't got off the treadmill? Should teachers be encouraged to be more free? Is this something that you need to have the base layer to be able to understand the questions in the first place? What's your view on teaching?
Yeah, no, that's a hard question because, of course, it relies on collaboration with teachers. So I shouldn't immediately launch a new sort of option or a module without consulting teachers. I think stories of people really matter. And this is in keeping with the BLM question, which was raised earlier by you, Peter. So having a diversity of perspectives means, having people of color who are not only in a certain kind of role. And so the kinds of people who feature in this book are very, very diverse people of color, some elite, some non-elite, etc., etc. So I think we need to have more stories of people for this period from different vantage points. And that's a starting point for secondary school teaching. I think we also need to take the British Empire story to places that it hasn't been before, because that is, part of the story that's taught in some schools. And I mean, as much as I like teaching Indian history and I, direct to Central South Asian studies, I think, we can't replace the history of the Second World War with more and more essays on the Indian Rebellion. I think we need, other kinds of accounts of the British Empire.
Well, I agree with that, but I mean, I think it's also about the availability of materials for younger readers. I think that's a real challenge.
So what would you say for your work?
I mean, there's something to talk to your publisher about. I did a children's version or younger readers version of Silk Roads, partly to address that fact, with children growing up, endless books about, billionaire grannies and those kinds of things, and fiction, Harry Potter, of course, but there's almost no good non-fiction for young historians. And what you learn having, with talking to school children, is that smart kids don't need to be, all kids don't need to be patronized, apart from in the specific Latin sense if they're your own kids. But there's no reason why the sponge of the young brain can't be widely open. But it's
David Olusoga has done the same.
Yeah.
David Olusoga has written for children, I think, recently.
Yeah, I think it's just about to come out, isn't it? Yeah, version. That's right. Yeah. Then some people's clocks suggest that they've got up, especially one at 4 o'clock in the morning, one at 2 o'clock in the morning, who've come tuned in. To what extent was the Euro-Western conception of revolution, with key characteristics that you mentioned, Sujit, like citizenship and rights and democracy, redefined by interactions with islander or indigenous revolutions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, it is. And I mean, there's a longer history of revolution in these parts of the world, which features here as well. And that kind of goes back to that earlier question about the prior traditions. So, I mean, Islam, as I mentioned, is a good example here. There is a tradition of resistance, and that is being redefined. So, I mean, that's a very big question. One could point to Islam, one could point to chieftaincy in the Pacific, one could point to Buddhist monarchy in the Bay of Bengal. As many as are the cases in the book, it's certainly the case that it's not simply just plonk, the Atlantic concept comes in and overrides indigenous senses of revolution. Much rather, there is this interchange which is uneven and at times violent, which generates a story.
I'm interested in this one. I noticed that you said you spoke to lots of people during your research, which sort of sounds sort of ethnographic, or anthropological, and so on. Tell us a little bit more about what you learned. What did stuff like that help open up doors to get new ideas going? Tell us about that.
I can't tell you, and I'm kind of surprised really at myself in some ways, because I don't think of myself like this often, but actually just being in the place. And I kind of say this to my graduate students still, go to the place you're writing about. There's no question about it. That's going to help.
Well, you pick very well, Sujit, anywhere that involves a trip to Mauritius for research.
Well, no, I was on an industrial estate, as I say in the book, where the archive is. I wasn't on a beach, except for a couple of occasions. No, but I mean, I think there's a way in which, really the story, I didn't know what the story was at times before I went to the place. And the place really matters. So for instance, the news about that oil spill in Mauritius recently, that's the site where one of the battles in the book was fought. So I think actually going and seeing what's going on there at the moment, what the memorials look like, what people do in that site, what stories they tell there, what the museum down the road, which had bits of ship, by the way, from various battles. That's just incredibly useful. And I'm not saying, certainly I spent much time in the archives as well, but I actually found that just directed the kinds of queries that I was asking in the archive. And certainly questions with generous scholars as well. So I'm really hoping that the book will be read in those places, but it's a challenge at getting it at times to some of these places, but that's one of my personal ambitions for the book.
Oh no, I'd have thought that the reception here has already been fantastic and will be globally, and not only in the regions that you write about, where I think that the interest is going to be enormous, but I think that that sort of reverse engineering of history, to be saying, look, here's a story that but looked at from a different perspective, it looks very, very different. And it's not just because these are new voices and they're interesting voices and the ones you don't know, they're challenging the narrative in the first place, which is, I think, a really ambitious thing to try to do, and then to pull that off as well. But I absolutely agree with you. Seeing places with your own eyes, even if it's seeing where people stood, and that is part of the process of being a historian. It's not just about visiting the archives and seeing the documents with your own eyes. I think you learn so much from standing still, breathing in the air, and getting your subconscious to be thinking about distances. About I remember when I was a young graduate student, and I read about the Danube as a frontier between Bulgaria and the steppe wells, up to the steppes that spread across the whole way to the Mongolian plains. And the way it had been written about by the historians, it made me think it was like the Amazon Delta, that it was impossible to cross except for under. And I went there, and you could kick a football across it. So you need to see these things to see what the bay's difficult to anchor in.
Yeah, exactly. And just writing about the monsoon in the middle of the monsoon, there's something about it that you kind of think, gosh, this really does matter. The monsoon does make a difference.
Okay, so Sujit, here we go, because it's 8 o'clock. Everybody deserves a good glass of red wine. But this is a good one to end on before I wrap it up. What was the most surprising thing that you came across during your research?
It's really hard because there's so many surprises, but in fact, the Aboriginal women off the coast of Tasmania, I would point to, because it was really moving to think about their histories, especially given the dramatic and violent depopulation.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the role of women in fishing more broadly off the coast of New South Wales as well, and the active role that they took whilst men just stood on the shore with their spears and so forth, near current day Sydney this is, but in Tasmania, off the coast of Tasmania, Aboriginal women swimming with dead seals and bringing them to these American and European men, or mixed, community, totally mixed community. And so it's not the way we think about masculinity in water, actually. So we think, European men going out and, sailing the seas, and Bungaree actually helped one of Matthew Flinders, the navigator. So actually you think about gender and water in a certain way. You think of water and navigation as very masculinized, but here it was totally different. And realizing that, you can hear their voices, but it's a story that was so violent.
Okay, and then my last sort of joker's question as a fellow historian, is it an enjoyable process for you writing, or is the joy the thinking, the learning, the joining the dots together? How was the book when you wrote it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I do enjoy writing. There's no question about it. I don't enjoy editing as much, but so I guess I sort of like the sort of first sort of wave, if you will, of writing. Good
metaphor, on brand. Waves across the south. Well, listen, I think on that note, I'm going to thank you, Sujit, for a sparkling talk. I'm going to congratulate you for an absolutely fabulous book. Everybody who has a chance to read it, to buy it for Christmas, to celebrate Sujit's fantastic research. It really is, it's a book about revolutions, but it's revolutionary too. And I know that those are really hard to write, and they're really hard to put a final full stop on. It looks spectacular. You've heard Sujit talk with enormous eloquence. So thank you all of you for giving up your time this evening. Thank you to the Alumni and the Development Office. But above all, thank you, Sujit Sivasundaram, for a fantastic talk tonight and giving up your time.
Thank you, Peter, very much for sharing it.